Hello, this is Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Shao, and with me are my co-hosts Eyad, Darius, and Sam Spieler.
Good evening.
Hey.
Today we are reviewing Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld. This is the second book in our series Alternate Histories, Alternate Realities. We will have 2 more episodes about Rodham in the upcoming weeks, where we will have a more in-depth discussion of this book. If you want to find us online, we are on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at r/canonicalpod. So Rodham, surprisingly, Eyad, was your pick for this series. I would say, and I think with a lot of confidence, that this is the least Eyad book that you have ever picked, and perhaps the least Eyad book that any of us has ever picked for our podcast here. Would you agree?
I don't know about that, no. I mean, you chose Parable of the Sower.
Okay. This is like a romance novel, kind of, and a political thriller. On a spectrum, this is pretty far from the Limeworks or any other Eyad novel.
I think what interested me the most, it's about somebody who is a real person and living. I think with a lot of alternate history books, they avoid being too prickly by talking about the past. It's like, what if Jesus Christ was Asian? What if a woman colonized America instead of men? Things that happened in the past, in the distant past, are not as interesting as the immediate past. And that to me was really interesting.
Did you know anything about Curtis Sittenfeld before you picked this book?
I did not. I am not a Curtis fan, really. I am really just attracted to the premise. And after I discovered who wrote it, I felt less compelled. I thought it would be a bit more edgy. I would say this is not an edgy book, but I was still attracted to the idea of talking about a person who is very contemporary and examining how their life could have been very, very different.
So let's talk about Curtis Sittenfeld then. She was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, attended Vassar and Stanford for her undergrad education, and went to the prestigious Iowa Writers' Workshop for her MFA. Rodham was her 6th novel and 7th book, and she previously wrote a novel titled American Wife, which I didn't read, I don't know much about, but ostensibly it's about Laura Bush, the former First Lady.
She isn't mentioned, but I think everybody who reads it is like, oh yeah, this is Laura Bush. Which I think it's pretty odd to write 2 novels about First Ladies in a row. It's like when your girlfriend with a glass eye discovers that all of your exes also had glass eyes, and she's like, what's going on? He'd be like, hey, I just got to type. You know, like 2 in a row is a bit much.
Well, they weren't in a row, though. That's the thing. It was interspersed, because I believe that was her 3rd novel. In between, she had a novel about twins with psychic powers or something, and there was a short story collection mixed in there. I'd say it's more like glass eye, peg leg, glass eye.
In a body of work, to have 2 First Lady novels, it's still pretty strong.
Just wait till the next on Melania.
I mean, actually, Sam, if there was a Melania book, I would read it.
If it were by Sittenfeld or by anyone?
By anybody. Like I said, this idea of writing books about people who are contemporary is really interesting to me. I think that we should see more of it.
Well, I will bring this up later when we talk about real person fiction, because, Yet, have I got a database for you? There are oodles and oodles of writing. Some would call them works of art. Other people would not. But we can save that discussion for later. I'd also note that she comes from a political family in that her brother, P.G. Sittenfeld, was a former member of the Cincinnati City Council. Former because he's faced legal trouble in recent years. And if you want to know more, you can just look up P.G. Sittenfeld. Rodham, the book, was published in 2020. It's an alternate history novel, like Eyad mentioned, where Hilary Rodham Clinton chooses not to marry Bill Clinton. The beginning of the book is a retelling of Rodham's experience as a student at Yale in her courtship with Bill Clinton. after Hillary Rodham rejects Clinton, it's weird because, we're so used to calling her Clinton that, like you have to call her Rodham in this case. After Hillary Rodham rejects Clinton, she goes on to teach at Northwestern as a law professor, and then she begins a political career and has other romantic pursuits. The book also features other real-life figures like former Illinois Senator Carol Moseley Braun and Donald Trump.
And the way Donald Trump shows up in this novel is quite a surprise. It's definitely putting the alternate in alternate history.
That was probably my favorite part of the book, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
That was one of my least favorite parts.
I don't know. Is this sexist to say that when reading a book about Hillary Rodham Clinton, my favorite part was Donald? Like, it's funny. I like it because that part of the book was the most surprising part of the book. And this is, I guess, we're getting to the review part of our podcast here. I wasn't surprised by almost anything in the book, but how Donald was used in the plot, I genuinely was surprised. And I thought the rendition of him as a character, it's a skewering, it's funny, but it's also quite true to life, I think. And, I just appreciated it. I think it was a nice catharsis in a way.
I guess I would agree with how you put it. It is interesting how he is used, but I would say the treatment of him feels expected to me.
I mean, you have a book about Hillary written in 2020. Obviously, Donald Trump is going to be involved in some way. Sittenfeld is a diehard Democrat, so you obviously know that there's no love lost between her and Donald Trump. So obviously, it's not going to be sympathetic. It's not a nuanced take on the man. The mechanics of exactly what happens, I think I agree with James. It's interesting because it's not exactly what I expected, but it is not a complex or politically sensitive portrayal.
Right.
One of the first things you mentioned, Sam, was about the sex in the book. And what you said was all right, but I like to read what Emily Adrian of the LA Review of Books said. Sittenfeld has a knack for describing intercourse in a way that makes a person never want to have it again. I believe, Sam, your comment was like, this book is fine if you want to read about your parents having sex or something like that. I thought the sex scenes were all right. Like, I wasn't turned off by it, but I did like the Emily Adrian quote. I kind of understand what she means because Hillary and Bill are so well known that it is weird, right, to read about them having sex. Is that what you meant, Sam, when you said, like, it's like your parents having sex? Or do they, like, dress up like Bill and Hillary when they do it? And is that what you mean? Like, I don't know about what goes on in your household.
Well, Sam, when you read those passages, are you thinking about like 60-year-old Hillary Clinton or 20-year-old Hillary Clinton? Because I think that's the difference. I wasn't creeped out by it because I was remembering all of this is happening when she's in school. This isn't the Hillary Clinton that we know. This is the Hillary Clinton from 70s.
Sure. It is hard for me to separate the two since even having seen photos of her young, it's hard for me to imagine a young Hillary. I remember both of them from the 90s, but that's as early as my personal memory goes. Early on, it really did feel that way. It felt a little like reading a book about family members that I knew well or something like that. But I saw a number of reviews and I read a couple interviews with Sittenfeld where she talks about this and how people roasted her for writing about the sex. And we're going to talk a little bit about this later, but we get to hear all about Bill's escapades in real life. And so seeing Hillary get to have fun, why should that be a problem? For me, it wasn't that it was a problem. It's just that I don't want to hear about Bill either. So I think Sittenfeld had a point, which again, we'll get to later, that there's a reason why we don't get to know Hillary this way elsewhere. It's not just that I didn't care, it's that it also was not very sexy to me.
I think we have to decide, though, whether we are opposed to detailed sex scenes in general, because this is something that came up when we read Kafka on the Shore as well. With Murakami, people always say his sex is bad, and there's often these weird details that we don't like. With this novel, I didn't think it was cringy in the same way as Kafka on the Shore, but what made it somewhat unsettling is how detailed it was. And I'm just wondering if these were people that Sam found hot, like young and sexy 20-year-olds, would he still object?
Probably the biggest issue for me was that it did feel like I was reading about people that I knew well and that those people were now, geriatric.
I think that a big part of the novel is about Hilary Clinton or Hilary Rodham having a sexual awakening as a young woman and discovering that a man could find her desirable. And then after she and Bill break up, it's also about the lack of sex in her life. So I think that sex and its absence are continuously important throughout the novel. So I'm not really bothered by it being described in detail because I think it is important. Like there's the scene where she goes to buy lube. That to me is also uncommon. Like, do we really need to find out how Hillary buys lube? Maybe not in most novels, but I think it's important in this one.
Maybe I'll amend that a little bit, yet, if I can correct you. Maybe not in most novels that we read. We, as in like three guys who don't read a lot of romance fiction.
Yeah. I mean, I also don't think that this is romantic, though. I don't think that that's the point either.
Another aspect of this book that I thought was interesting, this is something that it seems like all three of us will want to talk about in our respective further explorations of this book, which is the removal of complexity. And for this, I want to go to old friend Ron Charles, who wrote this in the Washington Post, but also it was reprinted in the SF Chronicle. Ron Charles says, as a study of sexism and American politics, Rodham is rich. But as a character study, it knows everything. That leaves little distance between the narrator and her words in which we can sense the mysteries of an actual mind. So I really like this because it kind of is a distillation of how I felt about the book. What is it about the book that feels shallow? It's the fact that Rodham, the character, feels too well known. And that's a feature and a bug because it's about a public character that we know very well. So in some ways, you're limited in how you can portray this character. But in other ways, I think it is a legitimate critique because there's like no subtext to her as a character, really. She's just very flat. And because of that, this book is a little bit unsatisfying. Like, as a character, she's not as rich as other characters in novels.
I think the problem with her as a character is that when we have a 400-page novel devoted to somebody that we think we know, we imagine that there is going to be a new layer revealed. We are going to get some sort of interiority. And we don't get that. What we get on the page is the same Hillary that everybody thinks they know. But we can look at that two ways. We can say this is a shortcoming of Sittenfeld as a writer, that she didn't get to some new level of Hillary. But we could also say that this is actually an accurate portrayal of a woman who is much more sincere and authentic than people give her credit for. And that is perhaps a very charitable reading, but we could say that when Hillary Clinton speaks so plainly, it's not her hiding something, but rather this is how she really feels about things. And I think that's where Sittenfeld kind of shows her sympathies here. I would say it's quite clear throughout the novel that Sittenfeld is a big fan of Hillary.
I agree with that, but I think that's not quite what Charles is saying, though. What he's saying is we have a first person narrator who is Rodham, and there never is any problem. She never makes a statement like along the lines of, I wanted to do this because I was ambitious. And you get the sense like, yeah, she's right. She's doing it because she's ambitious. That's why. Or she said, I wanted to do this because he offended me. And you never thought, oh, it's for any other psychological reason. She's saying it because she's covering something up. She's saying it because she's a flawed person. And all people make these statements when they're trying to hide this aspect of themselves. Like, that's the psychological richness that I think he's talking about, which is we all say stuff where we are trying to hide something about ourselves. That's what makes us human, because we have such psychological barriers in place. But this book is just her memoir. Like, it's a memoir of a political person who wants you to know, hey, this is who I am, without any of the subtleties, or he calls it mysteries. Any of the questions that you might ask when you read her say, well, I did this because of this reason. And you might have a question saying, did you really do it for that reason? Or was it because of X reason? There's a blow up with Bill, and there's no complexity to that blow up with Bill in the end of the book. You never think, oh, is she having a blow up with Bill because of X reason and she's been haunted by that since then and all that? No, it's just he said that, I said this, I was pissed at him, end of story, I moved on, you know? And you never get a sense like this is a real person who's haunted or conflicted or anything like that.
Yeah, I think we do get a character with flaws, but the flaws are so surface level and wrapped up so cleanly without too much exploration about what those flaws really mean.
Well, there is one part of the novel which I think is adding more complexity, and it's quite deliberate, when Hilary decides to run for Senate against Carol Moseley Braun. And then later on in life, she reconsiders it. And that reconsideration, I think, is as much complexity as Sittenfeld is allowing us to see. And even that is not much because it happens over the space of many years. We don't get the satisfaction of seeing somebody say something and think something different at the same time, which is what I think we're all kind of looking for. But again, I think it could be just that Sittenfeld sincerely believes that Hilary is just this plain-spoken woman, and there isn't that much else inside of her.
That's fine, but that doesn't make for great reading.
Well, here's something I think would have been interesting. This is my fan fiction version of her fan fiction. What if there's a scene where she's running against Barack Obama? In this book, it's kind of just, skimmed over. Like, they didn't really get into that election cycle. What if she's running against Barack Obama and she just laments the fact that all the black people are going to vote for him? I mean, that something like that wouldn't happen in this book because it might make her seem racist, right? But I would bet that the actual Hillary Clinton at some point in the campaign probably thought, well, damn, I'm going to lose all the black votes.
Well, something that I'm going to talk about later is that we get this uncomplicated version of her that gets to sidestep a lot of those things. We get to see a Hillary that never had to deal with the repercussions of certain things that Sittenfeld ties to Bill Clinton and things that were related to him, whether that's fair or not fair. But that sidestepping gives us this very uncomplicated view of a real person that had and has had big flaws. I think it does a disservice to her that way.
Besides the characterization of Hilary, I want to ask how you felt about the narrative structure of the novel. If we think of it as divided into two pieces, the first piece is her relationship with Bill, and then they break up, and then the second piece is her running for various offices. And the second piece, I think, is different in terms of its structure than the first piece. Did that difference bother you?
Well, there was that one part of the book where I think it was in one section she had two timelines simultaneously occurring, right? And when that happened, I was a bit surprised, but I wasn't bothered.
That's kind of what I'm asking about. I don't think it was two simultaneously, or at least I didn't read it that way. I was just thinking about it being so non-linear, where maybe you had two lines, but it kept jumping back and forth through different years. And the first part of the novel was more or less straightforward through, I guess, 1970 to 1974. And I was much more satisfied by the first linear part of the novel than I was by the second half.
I guess I was as well, but I got used to it. I think it goes along with Sittenfeld trying to cleanly link things of her past to things in the potential future.
The way it's structured in the second half is the focus is on the 2015-2016 election cycle, but she intersperses the intervening years linearly within that section, which makes it seem complicated when I describe it, but when I was reading it, I was fine. I've been criticizing Sittenfeld a lot, but actually I thought this book was well written. I think Sittenfeld's a good writer. I thought the structure for me was fine. I thought the prose was okay. And I really think a lot of the difficulties I had was mainly to do with her deciding to take on this subject matter, which I think forced her, Sittenfeld that is, to write a certain character a certain way.
See, I think the subject matter was fine. I like the subject matter. That's why I chose the book. But with the first half of the novel, you're getting a slice of life. It starts at one point and it just keeps going. And when I read, very biographical alternative history, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that slice of somebody's life. In the second half of the novel, because it kept bouncing around, the impression that I got is that the clear goal is the election in 2016. That is the thing that everything is focused on. And that to me is much less compelling because we already know a lot about that election. And to have the entire half of the novel focused on one specific thing is just not enough. I feel like there was much more interest in the first half because it wasn't just tied to one event.
So Rodham is a recent prominent example of real person fiction, or RPF. I actually didn't know about this. I am not big into fan fiction, but real person fiction is a subset of fan fiction about real people instead of fictional characters. And real person fiction has some serious ethical concerns, largely related to the privacy of an individual. I think we often think about fan fiction generally, but real person fiction specifically, as being kind of weird and creepy. I think I read someone who wrote an academic paper about this and used a Reddit source of someone saying real person fiction just feels icky. So I guess anything goes in academia now if you can use a Reddit source. But yeah, that's my sense. Like real person fiction and fan fiction sometimes can feel very icky because a lot of times it's slash, which is erotica, featuring, fictional characters, but in this case, real people. But real person fiction actually does have rich history. Shakespeare's historical plays can be considered as real person fiction. Hamilton is real person fiction. The Social Network is real person fiction. And I believe that also had some controversy. And I grew up reading Alfred Hitchcock's Three Investigators, and I don't think anyone else probably has because it's quite obscure. And the only reason why I read it is because my small school library had these leftover books from the 70s. Alfred Hitchcock's Three Investigators is a kind of a knockoff version of the Hardy Boys, which try to capitalize on Alfred Hitchcock's popularity. And it's these three guys who go around on adventures investigating stuff, and Alfred Hitchcock will make a cameo at the end of each book or at the beginning of each book, saying something like, "Well done, boys."
I mean, isn't the difference, though, that real person fiction is about people who are contemporary? It's not about people from, 100 years ago. It's people who are around and could read the book.
It is, but I don't think it's purely limited to that. I think real person fiction as a subset is not limited to only contemporaries, because you could write real person fiction about like Augustus or Jesus Christ. And in fact, there's a very famous real person fiction written like a couple of years ago about a love tryst between Jesus and Hitler. And I read a few lines of that love tryst story. And yeah, it is interesting.
That one aside, isn't the ick factor usually because they are contemporary?
I would say the ick factor stems from the fact that they're contemporary, but also stems from the fact that they tend to be slash. And I think people feel that it is unethical because you are taking real people and putting them in these relationships and making them have sex. And that's what makes people uncomfortable. Like if I were to write a story where you two are having sex, your family members would be like, why are you doing this? Like, why did you pick these two people? And couldn't you just pick fictional people? Like, why are you picking real people?
Well, the difference is that Sam is not a public figure, and I think that being a public figure carries the burden of having people talk and write about you all the time. Like, the sex scenes in Rodham, I think, are a bit much, and I can't imagine Chelsea Clinton having to read those. Like, I can see why people would feel it's awkward, but at the same time, I don't think that it is so awkward that it's wrong for Sittenfeld to write a novel like this.
Well, legally, you're right, because according to various lawsuits over the years, they have determined that because you call it fiction, it is fiction, so you can write about it. It's not libel. But do you think it's unethical?
Talking especially the sex scenes that we see in Rodham, if it wasn't so important to the novel, I would say that would make it awkward and perhaps in bad taste. If it were, for example, a real person novel about Joe Biden and there were lots of sex scenes, then I would say that's probably not in good taste. But for Hilary, I would say it's okay.
So if someone wrote slash, and I'm sure they have, about Biden and Kamala, you would say that that's not okay?
If there was a literary reason to include that relationship, then I could accept it. In the terms of this novel, I think that the sex scenes between Hilary and Bill have literary significance. I think they're not there just for the gratification of the reader.
I agree with Eyad. I think there is an ick factor, but I don't know if I would just flat out say it's unethical, especially if it's clearly labeled fiction.
I think I agree with you too, but the problem I have is while that's a legal distinction, like labeling something fiction makes it fiction, it feels like it's an out because then you can write about anything, slander anyone, and label it fiction and have it be true. I could, for example, write something terrible about, I don't know, pick your favorite politician or movie star or whatever, and then say, oh, it's just fiction. You know, he's not really Adolf Hitler.
I guess the difference is intent, right? And I think intent becomes pretty clear most of the time. Here, I'm siding with Eyad that the intent seems clear that they're trying to humanize someone and show a side of a person that, at least theoretically, we haven't seen. If it were really debasement and crass, it would be bad, but I don't think it would matter as much because no one would care. No one would read it.
Yeah, in terms of the law, calling it fiction can save you, but calling it fiction doesn't save you from being in bad taste. I think what prevents this from being in bad taste is because it's important to the story, and it's important to the way we understand a public figure.
Do you think there is any difference between this book, where it's obviously Hillary Rodham Clinton, and Sittenfeld's other book about Laura Bush? What if she wrote this book, Rodham, but instead of calling it Rodham, it's called like Rodman? And it's pretty much Hillary, but she just takes the extra step and makes everyone kind of, gives everyone a pseudonym. She dates like Phil Blinton, you know. Um, does it make a difference?
No.
It might make it even weirder, actually, to like try and cover those tracks, but only just barely. I think that would seem even creepier somehow.
Like, the only reason to change the names is for the sake of the law, but you don't need to worry about the law as long as you call it fiction. So if you change the names for another reason, why do it? Like, it's not going to fool anybody. So it's just this very conspicuous thing where, like, you know who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to name them. Like, why do that?
It's weird because fiction does it kind of all the time. You know, there's a spectrum where everything is inspired by real events of some sort, right? So I'm sure in the 50 books that we've read while doing this podcast, we've come across another book that is probably about a famous figure, but the writer just repurposed that figure. So I guess this is my roundabout way of saying that in some ways, this is my justification for real person fiction, and that all fiction is based on real events. A lot of fiction is based on real people, but they just are hidden better, or they just are changed more. Not because they're trying to be hidden, but because they're utilizing that person in a different way. And I think this one-to-one portrayal, this direct portrayal, is crass. I actually do think like it is kind of unseemly to write a book about some real person. But in some ways, it is very similar to other kinds of fiction that are inspired by real events, which is pretty much all fiction. So it's a matter of degree. So because of that kind of likeness, I'm more inclined to say it's okay and I'm more accepting of it.
What do you make then of the fact that there are characters in this novel that probably are stand-ins for other real figures? For example, now her name escapes me, but Hilary's friend and mentor, Gwen, yeah. I believe there is not a Gwen in real life, but there is someone that people have speculated this is probably who Gwen is supposed to be.
Yeah. And there is a real Nancy. I don't make anything of it, to be honest. I think that this is her trying to be more sensitive because characters who are portrayed not in a less flattering way, but sort of characters who become antagonists, I think she did change their names. Like Jennifer Flowers, the person who Bill allegedly had an affair with in the 1992 interview, the 60 Minutes interview that's covered in the book and in real life. The person in the book was not Jennifer Flowers. So I think in these kind of potentially sensitive areas, she chose to use a pseudonym or a different person entirely. And I think her lawyers or the Random House lawyers probably also said, hey, don't use Jennifer Flowers because we're going to get sued by her. So yeah, and change this and change this and change this so that Jennifer Flowers does not sue us. So I guess in the end, we all land on it being not unethical, right?
I mean, it seems pretty clear that this happens in not just fiction, but in the media all the time. Like in the case of a film, like a biopic like Ali or Malcolm X or something, those try to have a more direct relationship to reality, but still they're not 100% accurate. So, does that have any sort of ethical issue? I would say no. And I would say that if you tell people that you cannot write fiction about real people, you close off a very interesting way of writing fiction and a way of having a relationship to reality, but a freedom to tell a new story that I think is very interesting, and I don't think it's worth throwing away.
I think the difference there, and I agree with you because I think once again it's a spectrum. It's not really a huge difference, but I think the difference though is a biopic. There's a sense that it's a biography, that they will more or less stay true to the facts. Whereas if you have real person fiction, you have like Hillary hooking up with her colleague or something. I mean, that's fictionalized. So you're putting a real person in a situation that never actually occurred. That's, I think, what makes people feel uncomfortable. Because if it was just a portrayal, then it would be a biography. It wouldn't be fiction.
Yeah. I guess my position is that that discomfort is a good thing, and like it's just a sign that a boundary is being pushed in an interesting way. Like I'm not bothered by it at all.
I think one reason why there's so much maligning of real person fiction and fan fiction is one, they tend to be very poorly written. And two, as a byproduct of them being very poorly written, they tend to focus on the slash aspect or on the writer's own kind of wish fulfillment as fan service. Like, what if Hillary and Kamala got together? Like, what's the point in that? Is there any intellectual exploration? Is this interesting on any level besides this writer's personal wish fulfillment of, I want to imagine what it's like for Hillary to date Kamala Harris? It's bad writing and it's ill-considered writing for the most part. And this is what separates this book from that, in that this is not bad writing. It's quite good writing. and it's more considered. It's not as considered as a lot of other Eyad picks, but it's definitely more considered than your average fan fiction that is matching up, Mario and Luigi, or for example, or something.
Wow, that's quite the praise there, Eyad.
Yeah, I'll take it. It's the first time I've gotten any praise out of James, so...
Barbara Vandenberg of USA Today said in her review that Rodham is delectably discussable, a book tailor-made for book clubs. My first thought was like, yes, I agree. It is a book tailor-made for book clubs. And then I thought to myself, but why do I agree, James? Why do I agree? And then my third thought was, you're right, James, we should consider this and discuss it further in a podcast episode. So, do you first agree that this is a book tailor-made for book clubs? And if you instinctively did agree, why did you agree?
What is the euphemism going on here? When people say it's made for book clubs, what do they really want to say?
That's the subtext I would like to get at, because I think that's what she's saying. And I didn't actually read most of her review. I just read this part and I thought, okay. But what is she saying? Is she insulting the book?
I think she's insulting the reader.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think she's insulting the book per se, but she is slighting book clubs a little bit. And I don't think she means to be, but I think that's what is happening. She's saying the same thing that we have said on this podcast before about a book being a book club book. We've said the same thing about Buddha in the Attic, for example.
Yes.
I think it speaks to the kind of reader that this attracts, right?
Well, Eyad, so yes.
You give this book to anybody, and they are not going to tell you what's the point. You read Rodham, you know exactly what the point is. So it offers itself up to the casual reader very readily. So that's, I think, what makes it suitable for book clubs. And I think the perhaps kind of sexist thing going on here is perhaps Vandenberg is saying that it's mostly women who are these kinds of readers who go to book clubs and they don't really know how to get at what a book means. So this is the kind of book that works for them.
I think it's her phrasing, delectably discussable. Like, delectably is something you would use to describe like a sumptuous snack, And it's like, ooh, look at this. And discussable. It's just very weird to say, well, this book is delectably discussable. It's kind of minimizing it from a work of literature to like a snack you consume when you meet someone at 3:00 for tea.
I mean, it is USA Today, James.
What's wrong with USA Today? It's about the country today.
I mean, it's no Ron Charles.
James, there are big sections of this book that felt like gossipy people talking about things. People talking about politics, except not in political senses, in gossipy senses.
I think there is actually like a scene where women giggle. I mean, and that's the thing is like, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. What I said earlier was this is not the kind of book we tend to read. And I'm glad we're reading it because I'm tired of the books we're always reading. So it's a nice change because we don't tend to read these kinds of, I called it a romance and I still think it's kind of like a romance. It's like a feminist romance novel. I think the problem with this review is it seems very limiting, right? When you say this book is only about X, when it's about X plus a little bit more.
I mean, we haven't had the pleasure of reading Vandenberg's full review, so I don't know what else she says there, but I mean, would you disagree that it's
delectably
made
discussable
for book clubs? Yeah. I mean, she makes it sound like a pleasant thing, like that's a positive.
Nothing like Bill and Hilary going at it to make it very delectably discussable. All right, so do you think this book will have any impact in 10 years or 50 years from now?
It'll be different. I mean, by that time when Hilary is dead, it'll become less like what it is and more like Hamilton. That will make it much less interesting.
But people love Hamilton.
Yes, but I don't want to get in trouble with the Hamilton fans as well as the USA Today fans. So I'm going to just keep my mouth shut. But I just think that the big point for me with this novel is that it came out in 2020 and I could read it and Hilary could read it at the same time. And that's just interesting to me.
Yeah, I really wonder if she has even picked up this book. Like, if I were her, I probably wouldn't. But at the same time, I'd always be wondering.
In one of the interviews I read of Sittenfeld, they asked her if Hilary has read it. And she said she wasn't sure. She didn't know, but she debated whether to send it and ultimately decided not to because she didn't want to look like a stalker and make it about herself. But yeah, I mean, I could see Hilary reading this and feeling fine about it.
Do you think she'd have to hide it from Bill?
No, all right. I don't know if this goes against the Hilary we see in this novel or not, but I would bet that the real Hilary would hold it up and go, huh? Huh? Did you read this yet, Bill?
Yeah. Now, I don't think that Hillary would have a problem with this book at all, but I think Bill definitely would.
Well, we've talked more about Trump than we have about Clinton here. I think the Bill Clinton in this book, the portrayal of the Bill Clinton in this book is I'm I'm hesitant to say that it's inaccurate, but I think it is definitely the fringes of how we might consider Bill the person to be, because it is making certain assumptions about like his attitudes toward women and sex. I think perhaps a lot of women would feel the same way, but I think also a lot more people would not say that Bill is like this or how they understand Bill. I don't know. I mean, that's my understanding of Bill Clinton. I haven't read his biography or anything. Did you guys feel the same way? Did you feel like the portrayal of Bill was a bit over the top?
When he leaves politics, he has a second career, which is one that I would never have picked for him. I would never have guessed that he would be involved in that world. And that, to me, made it seem unusual, but I don't really have any data to say why it wouldn't happen. It just doesn't feel like something that would.
Well, I'm talking about the sex stuff, but yes, also that part.
Well, the sex stuff, I think it depends how forgiving a person you are. And basically, when I read this novel, my sense is that Hillary in the novel basically accepts that Bill Clinton is a guy who just likes fucking too much. And, gosh darn it, he wants to be a good guy, but he just loves fucking. And in that sense, he is not like this sex predator that a lot of people think of him as. And that's what might feel off to a lot of people, is he's much more sympathetic than I think a lot of people would see him.
Oh, that's interesting because I thought he's way less sympathetic than how a lot of people view him.
When you think about the real life Bill Clinton and all of these things that have been brought up against him, why do you think he behaves this way and continues to behave this way? Like, why is he not more chaste?
I don't know, but this book kind of offers an understanding of him, which is what I think is, in some ways, more uncomfortable than the portrayal of Hillary. I just generally feel uncomfortable diagnosing people, public figures, and saying, yeah, this person is a sex addict.
What it solves, though, is it solves people's difficulty with uncertainty. People avoid uncertainty, and knowing whether or not somebody is a quote-unquote sex addict allows them to decide how they feel about him, whether or not he's forgivable. I think with Bill Clinton, it matters a lot because a lot of women don't want to forgive him, but I think Sittenfeld offers this in the novel as a way to allow us to forgive him.
Really? Because I didn't get that sense. I don't know if, Sam, you are in the middle here, but I didn't get the sense that the Bill Clinton was forgiven in any way in the book.
I am in the middle because I think I think you're both right in some way. I think Eyad is right that it is offered as this explanation, but we also get these accusations and sureties of not simple infidelity, and we do get that, but we also get predatory behavior.
Well, stated as fact. I mean, setting aside the power dynamics of what happened in the Oval Office, there's a very stark difference between that and like what he's accused of in the book, which is stated as fact, which never happened in real life, right? As far as I know. I mean, I'm not up to my Bill news, but as far as I know, what happened in the book at the end never happened to him in real life.
Right. So that's what I mean, is that there is an explanation for why he's like this, that maybe it's not predatory, but there's also, like you say, the stated as fact, there were predatory times. You can read that as this is someone who grapples with something, with this addiction or whatever you want to call it. But you can also read it as someone who grapples with this thing and is not really grappling at other times. He's just going for it.
We often pillory Trump for being especially nasty, right, in politics, and stooping to any level to win. And in what happens near the end of the book, Bill kind of becomes like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that who Bill is? Because my sense of Bill is he is a smooth politician, but I never got the sense that he would be so cutthroat as a politician. I mean, maybe it's because I only remember him as like, Fat Bill, the McDonald's eating president, and not like Bill the campaigner. But he just never struck me as like ruthless Donald, And that part of the book really bothered me because I was like, would Bill do this to win?
Not just that, but making Donald the buffoon that he is, but in essence softening his image in order to make Bill the more Donald-like figure.
I think here we also have to remember that this is alternate history, and the Bill who does these things in the novel might be doing them specifically because he's not married to Hilary. And perhaps that part of the history that has changed him in a way that makes a big difference.
That is something that you end up having to do in your brain as you're reading this, is think about whether Hilary would turn out the way she does without Bill, and whether Bill would turn out the way he does without Hilary. And I guess your different levels of comfort come from how well you're able to square those things, how believable, I guess, those things are.
All right, let's wrap it up. Thank you for listening. If you disagreed with how we felt about this book, you can let us know on Reddit or on social media at CanonicalPod. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with an in-depth discussion of Rodham. If you're interested in joining that discussion, go ahead and find a copy of this book. Till then, happy reading, and we'll talk to you soon.